Hello, and welcome back to the Alpha Male Podcast, the podcast where we talk about what it means to be an alpha male in today's society: strong, dominant, in control, made in the image and likeness of our Creator, God the Almighty, and we don't apologize for that. If you're listening, we recently tried to start something new on this podcast: Manly Pursuits episodes. Shorter episodes on a single manly skill and pursuit that you may have already or may want to incorporate in your life. So, to keep these episodes short, we'll roll into a quick, abbreviated biography and into the main topic. As always, I'm your host, Michael Melito. First and foremost, I am a servant of God. God is number one. I hope to recognize that in everything that I do, this podcast being no different. Grew up hunting and shooting and doing all manner of outdoor stuff in the South. Joined the Marine Corps at 17, did a couple of combat tours in Iraq. After that, I was an urban warfare instructor for the Marine Corps. Also served in the U.S. Army. Served also in law enforcement with LAPD, regular assignment, and more specialized assignments. I've also been a private contractor for a 3-letter government agency I won't specify. I've been the commander of a tactical team where our primary objective was to stop active shooters in a large metropolitan area. I've been blessed to win more shooting competitions than I can remember, mostly in handgun, but also in rifle. Blessed to be a state rifle and pistol champion a few times over, but I've also competed in archery and all manner of other things, from black powder, even hatchet throwing. I have been a professional big game hunter and guide, and been blessed to be able to hunt all over this beautiful country, either professionally or just on my own for putting meat on the table and recreation. Anything from white-tailed deer on the East Coast to mule deer on the West Coast to elk and bear and wolf and slaying all manner of beasts, and I don't apologize for that either. Blessed be the Lord my rock, who trains my hands for war and my fingers for battle. Alright guys, today's episode is a listener request, and it's going to be on archery. Now, I talked a little bit on my bio, but I grew up hunting at a very early age, and I grew up shooting a bow at a very early age. I took my first bear with a bow, archery, when I was somewhere between 15 and 17. I honestly don't remember. I have a picture of it. It meant a lot to me, but that was pre-digital days, and there's no date or anything recorded on there. I want to say I was probably 16 when I took my first bear with a bow. I started practicing with archery long before that, back with the old cheap kids' bows, just a piece of fiberglass, basically. Had a little compound bow. I had a couple of recurve bows. Actually, down from God Almighty and my wife, in that order, the third best friend that I'll ever have, Patrick. I met him when I was very young, I don't know, 5 or 6 or 7, when I was out in some field practicing archery, and he came by and wanted to practice with me, and he's like a brother to me, and still is. So I have a long history with archery. I've competed in archery. I did quite a bit of the 3D shooting, if you're not familiar with that. It's where you go out and practice for hunting or just for fun, for competition, and you shoot basically styrofoam. It's not really styrofoam, but that's an easy way to picture it. It's really thick, dense foam in the shape of deer and elk and pigs and bear and all manner of things, and you compete in that, and you keep a score. And I've done that quite a bit, competed in that. And after a long hiatus, I recently this year got back into archery. And this one is a listener request, so I figured I would talk about it. Why archery for a manly skill? Well, I think any good martial skill is important. Now, if you listen for any length of time, you'll know, if you normally listen to this or Gunfighter Life, another podcast done here under Good Shepherd Training, you'll know that guns and gunfighting is a big thing, and I've been a professional gunfighter for most of my adult life, as you might have heard in the bio. And I think any martial skill is important. And I mostly focus on shooting because if I get into a physical altercation that's deadly is most likely going to involve a gun, because I carry a gun on me pretty much all the time when I'm awake and out of the house. And that is a martial skill in and of itself. But archery has benefits. I have a regiment where I try and practice every day my shooting skill, my shooting ability. I try and practice that every day. I don't practice archery every day because I don't anticipate it being a skill to save my life anytime in the near future. But it is a good martial skill. It has some similarities with shooting in that when you're doing it and you're doing it right, all the troubles of the world, all the cares of the world, everything else seems to melt away. And you get a deep focus. Like when I'm shooting, that deep focus on the front sight or on the optic and on, the stance, the grip, the breath in and out, the movement of the sight, the finger on the trigger, the clean, steady break of a good shot. You get all that in archery as well. A good skill that you can focus on. That kind of helps you forget about all the other troubles and tribulations of the world and focus. Because if you're truly focused on that one thing at that one time, like I said, everything else kind of melts away. And that could be done in a lot of martial skills, a lot of physical hands-on skills that I think are lacking in a lot of men's lives in this age of the cubicle. And I think getting back to some of those is important. And you can certainly get that in archery. Some of the benefits of archery is that you can do it. It's not loud like a gun, and people don't have this ridiculous aversion to archery like a lot of people have with guns. For instance, when I was a commander of a tactical team in that large metropolitan area that I mentioned, I couldn't just go outside of my suburb and go shooting. But I could do that even in a very densely populated area. Even in the driveway, I could practice my archery skills. And people driving by in their little SUVs and their suburban life didn't even bat an eye at me shooting, a recurve bow into a styrofoam target. But I certainly probably would have had the police called on me if I'd have been out there with a handgun. Not even live firing, just dry firing with no ammunition. Just practicing my draw, in broad daylight in the middle of the street probably would have been an issue. But with archery, it wasn't an issue. So this is a martial skill that you may be able to practice even if you live in the suburbs or in a city. It may be an easier sell to get somebody into weapons that's not, that has an aversion to firearms, maybe a stepping stone into that. Another good thing is for hunting, putting meat on the table. And now, archery hunting is not as effective as hunting with a firearm. That's why there are special seasons for it. But because there are special seasons for it, it can get you in the woods longer and be able to hunt a longer season in the year in most places, in better times of the year. It gives you more of a hunting opportunity. And it's a much harder skill. Archery takes practice and commitment. A lot of hunters don't put that in. They just want to grab a gun and go ride around in their truck and hop out and walk 50 yards, after their rifle's been sighted in and shoot. And I'm not going to put anybody down for that if they want to put meat on the table. But archery takes much more dedication, which means I believe, I haven't looked up any numbers, but there are probably far less archery hunters than firearms hunters, which means that it gets you out in a time of the year where there aren't as many hunters. And that's kind of nice. It also, generally, here in America, I don't know where you're listening to this from, I'm very blessed to have some international listeners, but here in America, generally, archery seasons are in a much nicer time of the year, like in the fall. I like to hunt and spot and stalk, and I like to wear, light clothing and cover a lot of ground. And that's nice in archery season where you can go out and see the leaves change and the weather's still nice. It's not freezing cold. So archery has that advantage. It lets you put meat on the table. Maybe you live, in an area or in a country where you don't have, where you do have the right to self-protection, but it's been taken away in the forms of firearms. But you can still hunt and put meat on the table with a bow and arrow. And for all those reasons, archery is a manly pursuit, a manly skill. If you get nothing out of it other than what we talked about in the beginning, just the focus and, training your body to be great at something, I think that in and of itself is a good thing. Psalm 144, blessed be the Lord my rock, who trains my hands for war and my fingers for battle. Or let's not forget Psalm 18. It is God who arms me with strength and makes my way perfect. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer. He sets me on high places. He teaches my hands to make war so that my arms can bend a bow of bronze. Men, manly men, alpha men, mighty men of war, made in the image of God, for it is written, the Lord is a man of war. And if the Lord is a man of war and we are made in his image, ought we not to have some martial skills? And you don't have to do archery. You can do other stuff, handgun, hand-to-hand combat. I think it's good to be well-rounded, but archery is certainly a way to do that. And the next part of this podcast, I'd like to talk about the different kinds of archery. So archery can be, very basic. People have been hunting with a bow and arrow for a long time. For thousands of years, men have been using a bow to put meat on the table and to wage war. And the earliest bows, obviously, were probably pretty crude, just literally a piece of dried wood, a stick with a string or a piece of sinew, animal sinew on it, to launch another stick. And if you're talking about the most basic today, you can, making your own bow and arrow, being a bow or a fletcher, that's a whole nother martial skill that I don't pretend to possess. But you probably are going to buy a bow. If you want to get into the most basic, you're talking about just a straight long bow. And it's literally what it sounds. It's just a long bow. It's a long, straight piece of wood. Sometimes made out of just one monolithic piece of wood. Sometimes different kinds of wood, spliced and glued together. But basically just a long piece of wood that you take a piece of animal sinew, or more likely today a piece of spectra or more advanced fiber, and make a string for it. And you get arrows and put them on there and pull it back and let it go. The next probably progression of that is the recurve bow. And you know how a regular bow, if you picture just your most basic bow, it's just a bow like the letter D, with the curved part being the bow and the straight part being the string. A recurve bow curves twice, so it's like a D in the middle and it curves back out at the ends. And that has some mechanical advantages, gives you a little bit more power. Likely that was a pretty big advantage when that was developed by man for warfare and for hunting. You can go that route. You can also go the compound route. Now the compound bow, especially of today, is a very complex machine. If you look at the amount of engineering and complexity in a modern, let's say Matthews or PSC state-of-the-art compound bow, it rivals, if not exceeds, the amount of engineering and workmanship and complexity that's in a Glock handgun. It's a very complex piece of machinery. State-of-the-art, technology with all kinds of carbon fibers and composites and reinforced glass materials and magnesium risers or carbon fiber risers and screws and pulleys and all manner of different mechanical parts that work like a Swiss watch together to give you the maximum amount of power and velocity in an arrow. And those have some advantages. They have a lot more power. They have a lot of let off, meaning with your traditional bow, the farther you pull it back, the more weight there is on it. A compound bow has what's called let off. So you may have the maximum amount of pull in the middle, and then it breaks. And if you let's say have an 85% let off, if your bow has a 100-pound draw weight, and that's really, really high. Most people don't pull a 100-pound bow. I'm just giving this for easy math. If you had a 100-pound compound bow with 80%, 85% let off, then when you got it all the way back, you would be holding back 15 pounds, give or take, if those numbers were correct. So a lot of people like those for big game hunting. They certainly have their advantage, but they have their disadvantages too. They're very precise aiming, which means it generally takes longer. And they have a lot of power, which means they're generally good for one thing, which is hunting big game, deer and elk. The compound of the recurve bow has the advantage of it can be drawn and fired quickly, easily, snap shooting. Better for small game hunting. And they're much simpler and generally easier to afford. and a much simpler machine. So it really depends on what you want and what you want to learn to do. I now am in the recurve camp. I use a recurve bow. That is my only bow that I own. But for a lot of years, I was a compound shooter, and I've got nothing against that either. It just really depends, like I said, on what you want and the skill that you want to have and the tool that you want to use. Next, we'll talk about arrows. If we're talking about traditional basic arrows, you're talking about wood. And wood is basically the worst choice unless you want tradition. Like, they're not very strong. They tend to come out of being straight very easily. They break very easily. The only real reason for a wood arrow is if you want the traditional skill, the traditional style. And there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not putting that down. I'm just saying that's the advantage of it, is it's traditional. Years ago, especially when I was coming up in archery, it was aluminum. That was the advancement. Really today, unless you're a competition shooter and have a niche application for aluminum, they've pretty much gone by the wayside and been replaced with carbon fiber. Carbon fiber, as far as practicality goes, in my opinion, is better for pretty much everything. It's stronger, it's straighter. It's gotten to the point where they're very affordable. They're much harder to break. So if you're looking for a practicality standpoint, you're going to want carbon arrows, in my opinion, like I said, unless you want they're more traditional. Oh, and I forgot to mention one thing about advantages and disadvantages. If you're getting into archery, a compound bow has to be fitted to you. It's not like a recurve bow or a long bow are much more forgiving in that, unless it's something ridiculously big or ridiculously small, it'll fit most people. But a compound bow has to be fit to you, the proper draw length, because once you pull it back, it stops at a definite wall, which is an advantage because it means it stops in the same place every time, giving you more consistency. But it means it has to be precisely fit to the shooter. So unless you're going to go to a pro shop and get fitted and actually know your draw length, that may be another advantage to the recurve or the longbow. I just thought I'd throw that in there so you didn't just go on, OfferUp or eBay or something and buy a compound bow thing. You can just take it out and shoot it. You have a range and can be adjusted, but generally that takes a pro shop, and you may not fall into that range. They're pretty specific. I just thought I'd mention that. When it comes to arrows, we talked about that. There's also the fletching, what you think of as more traditional feathers. They do make synthetic feathers, and those are good, and they can be used even today, and they give you a more traditional look and more traditional function. But if you're talking about practicality, weather resistance, things like that, the more traditional feathers tend to fall by the wayside to what are called today vanes, usually made out of PVC or a soft moldable plastic that is glued to the arrow. They're weather resistant. They tend to give you a little bit more velocity, I believe. They tend to be a little bit sturdier. So that's probably what you're looking at in today's archery world. And there's a couple of different kinds of points. The main two is your field point or your bullet point, which is just for practice for shooting into your regular archery target, which for a lot of people that may be all you ever do. And then when you get into the world of broadheads, when you talk about broadheads, you're talking about killing animals, killing flesh. And for that, you have your more traditional, what you would think of as, arrowheads. And then you have mechanical broadheads, which have all manner of mechanical devices that when you hit something, they expand and open up with like razor blades that fold out. And both of those have advantages. By the time you're practiced enough and get to that point, you'll probably have done some research and figure out what you want. I like the more traditional, regular style broadheads, but I've seen the mechanical ones, especially when I was a professional hunter and guide. I cannot argue with their effectiveness. Then you have some more specialized points. You have like the judo points and the small game hunting points, which I also have. And they're more or less like a blunt tip for obviously shooting birds and small game. So there it is. Just a brief discussion of archery. A pursuit that men and manly men have been doing for thousands of years. Be a man. Have a martial skill. Maybe archery is something you're already into or you want to get into. I'm not saying you have to. There's plenty of alpha males out there that don't do archery. but I think that it is a good pursuit and a worthwhile pursuit, as long as it doesn't take away from something else more important, like reading your Bible or being proficient with your handgun, which is probably going to save your life. You know, I love archery, but don't think that because you've seen a bunch of episodes of The Walking Dead that, you know, a bow and arrow is as effective as a firearm. It is not. It will not replace a firearm. There's no army today sending their soldiers into battle with crossbows or longbows or recurve bows. You know, that would be ridiculous. It's not as effective as a firearm. It has some advantages because of regulations and for hunting, and it can, like I said, be used in it's more permissive in a lot more environments. But it's a good skill to have just to have, and it's a good way to put meat on the table. So I hope you've enjoyed this episode, and I hope if you haven't ever done it or have been thinking about getting into it, this episode was encouraging. Certainly, I don't think anybody would argue that archery is not a manly pursuit. If you like this episode or any of the other Alpha Male podcasts, hope you'll consider supporting the umbrella that houses this podcast, as well as Gunfighter Life if you're more into the gun side of things, and if you care about the stuff. Simple Man Sermons, preachings of a simple man called by God to share the good news of Jesus Christ. Just put it out by God's grace an episode on that earlier. If you want to support, consider going to goodshepherdtraining.com. That's the umbrella that houses these podcasts. You can scroll down to Patreon and consider supporting for the fraction of the cost of what you're probably going to pay for one arrow if you get into archery, or certainly the fraction of the cost of one box of ammo new at the store. Consider supporting. We recently hit a milestone. You know, we have a host that we upload these podcasts to so they can be available on the internet. And recently, after years of podcasting, by God's grace, we reached a limit to what they would have. And if it wasn't for the generous supporters of people that support and help out on this podcast, I probably would have just deleted a bunch of older episodes. And I'm not, you know, a computer geek that has a giant room full of servers. I usually either talking to my iPhone or talking to a laptop. I don't have some place where all those older episodes are stored. So that means they likely would have just been gone if it wasn't for the support of people that support this podcast. But I thought, since there are people that support, I would go ahead and upgrade and get, you know, more storage space on the host. And I thank the listeners for that. That's a direct illustration of how your money goes to help and support. Also, if you know I've been listening for a long time, you'll know for years, I just talked into the iPhone and uploaded it. I didn't edit it. I didn't do any software thing. I didn't have any fancy microphones. You know, it also helps with that. Anyway, if you want to give, again, go to goodshepherdtraining.com. Scroll down to the Patreon page. Consider supporting this message or any of the other Alpha Male messages. And if not, don't worry and don't feel guilty about it. My God supplies all my needs. If you want to be a part of it, be a part of it. If not, I'm not worried. If you want to support in other ways, you can like, subscribe, leave a comment of the podcast on whatever platform you're listening to this to. Leave a review. Leave some stars. Anyway, with that, men, I'll say thanks for listening. And have a blessed day. For my tactical tip, I'm going to give one on archery, and this is more of a suggestion from me. If you are a shooter, if you're good with shooting in iron sights, and you're looking into getting into the world of archery, and you want the most amount of flexibility, I would say look for a recurve bow that takes down, meaning that you have a riser, that's the middle of the bow, and two limbs that generally attach by screwing on there. This gives you some flexibility in that you can take it down and store it in a small place or carry it easily in a pack. But also, most of these have a riser that you can mount a sight on, whether that's your older just pin screw sights, and you can look that up if you don't know what I'm talking about. So you can have a front bead sight or pin sight with like a fiber optic cable, and you can have a rear peep sight, which when you're good at it and you get a sight picture is remarkably similar to like an AR-15 or an M1 Garand or an M14 sight picture. So if you're familiar with that, it's an easy it's a easier transition than it is learning another way. And like I said, if you're new, if you get into compound bow shooting, you can get the same kind of sight picture, but you have to get it specifically tailored and fitted to you, and there's a lot that goes into that. So unless you're going to go to a pro shop and dedicate to that, I would say the easiest way, in my opinion, to get into archery, if you're going to DIY it, is to get a takedown recurve bow that gives you all that flexibility of being able to shoot, small game, large game. It's able to be taken down. It's less complicated, and it'll generally fit most people as long as you're not like ridiculously big or the bow's not ridiculously small. And if you're familiar with shooting, it lets you get that more traditional sight picture. There's a lot different in archery and shooting, but at least that part will be more familiar. So if you're looking to get into it, that would be my advice to you. If you say, I don't want to do that, I want to get the more traditional, just stick bow hunting, just a long bow with no sights, no nothing, and learn how to snap shoot or instinctive shoot, I'd say great, good on you. Even if you don't get into archery, I hope you liked today's episode and you learned a little bit about archery. Thanks, men. Until next time, be strong and courageous.